Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Melnick, brought to you here from Netwrix. Today we've got an interesting webinar. Honestly, I hope we always have an interesting webinar for you, but today we've got Managing SharePoint Online and Exchange Online with PowerShell. A lot of our PowerShell webinars have been pretty popular, so just going to keep driving forward this. So before we dive into the webinar content itself, let me touch briefly on some of the housekeeping. And I think you guys are all sort of familiar with a lot of these. We'll just kind of juke through these. So again, everybody's on mute, not probably a real surprise to everybody. If you have questions, please let us know. Drop them down into the questions window. We'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. We certainly want this to be interactive as well. So again, drop any questions you have in there and let us know. And I think that's actually, oh yes, the old slides. I'm sure someone will jump on 3 minutes from now and ask if the slides will be available. Yes, they will, as well as a link to a copy of the recording. So we'll try to keep your time pretty much allotted to about 60 minutes. So we know your time is precious. We appreciate you spending it with us. And with that having been said, I think I'll dive into the agenda real quick. I think that's it. So we're going to be talking about a bunch of interesting things. So obviously just straight up connecting to Office 365. We're going to talk quite a bit about management as well. So Exchange Online and then SharePoint Online. Permissions management, and also I think we're going to touch a little bit on some auditing as well through some of the interface, and then the Netwrix Auditor demonstration as well. And then we'll dive in, we'll do a Q&A. There is a prize drawing at the end as well. So if you hang out to the end, which we would appreciate, obviously, we're giving away a $100 gift card. So we'll draw somebody at random, choose them, and congratulations, you will win, hopefully. So with that, so let me introduce Mr. Liam, and I'll let him take over and run wild with PowerShell.
Cool, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having us again. Hey, everybody, I'm excited to be on the webinar again, and I'm excited to talk about PowerShell. Believe it or not, I still stand by that PowerShell is one of the greatest hacking languages on the planet, even though we're not going to talk about hacking today, because think about it, PowerShell exists on more or less every single Windows device. So if you can do something with PowerShell, you can do it on any of those devices. So what we're going to talk about today, first off, I wanted to talk about some kind of prerequisites with Office 365 and PowerShell. Obviously your initial setup of what's required, and then we'll kind of flow through talking about how we connect to it and the kind of different things we can do. So first off, obviously for PowerShell, we need a supported version of Windows. So that's going to be an x64 version of Windows. You'll need the Microsoft.NET Framework 4.5 and higher, the Windows Management Framework. Now, the good news is that if you're using Windows 10, for example, all of that comes with it. If you're using a previous version of Windows, by now you probably have updated to at least these versions here. You'll also need to download what's called the Microsoft Online Services Sign-In Assistant. That's always a short name to have to read off, but that's the under the covers component that will kind of allow you to sign in from a Windows machine or some other machine to the cloud itself. And then, of course, the last thing is the installation of the PowerShell modules themselves. Now, this is really important because these do change. So, for example, we have Azure Active Directory, original version 1 and version 2. We have the SharePoint Online Management Shell. Then we have Exchange Online PowerShell version 2, which was actually literally just released recently in the past few weeks. There's a version 1 of that, which is what we're going to talk about today. And then, of course, an optional one for you is the Azure Active Directory for the graph. Now, what these are custom, effectively, DLLs and modules that get downloaded into your PowerShell, if you're using PowerShell ISE, and then they become available so that you can then go ahead and utilize. And these contain all of the commands that you wish to execute. If you don't have these, then obviously you're not able to, for example, if you don't have the SharePoint Online one, you can't use connect-SPO service, which is the fundamental connection to Office 365 and SharePoint Online. So from an installation step perspective, ensure that your account is a global administrator within Office 365. Trust me, it's much easier to start there. Even though under the covers, every single account in Azure Active Directory and Office 365 can execute PowerShell, they can't necessarily do configuration changes. So that may be one thing that you may not be aware of, that any account in Office 365 has the ability to execute PowerShell in the context of them. That can be changed as well. We'll obviously install the Microsoft Online Services Sign Assistant first. That gives us the connection. Then we'll install the Azure Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell. Then the next option here was really just an optional one to install the graph module. I tend to like doing that just because the graph is the amalgamation of all of the services in Office 365. And so you can actually make a call into the graph to be able to retrieve information. For example, I could say, go and find everything about Liam, and it would come back and give me Exchange, Azure AD, SharePoint Online, Skype for Business. Whatever you wanted to bring back, it comes back in that single module. Then, of course, install the SharePoint Online Management Shell, and then you can install the SharePoint Exchange PowerShell version 2 module. Now, the one that I'm going to use is one where we import it from a PS session, which is a little bit different. They now have this dedicated Exchange Online PowerShell version 2 module, which does not have all of the commandlets that you would expect. It only has a subset of them, but that will change, and then more will be available. So let's talk about Azure Active Directory then. So Azure AD is fundamentally the authentication stack within Office 365. And so some of the activities and the management and configuration that you will need to do actually belongs there. That's where you would make changes. So to install the Azure AD module modules, we're going to use inside a PowerShell window. Now, I prefer to use the ISE window just because it's more of a richer interface than just a standard command line. So we're going to execute install-module MS Online, and this will give you the Microsoft Online Azure AD connection, and it also communicates across with Office 365. We can also then install the Azure AD module. So I can say install module Azure AD. And then there's also the Azure AD preview one as well. Now you can run these side by side. It will prefix the commandlets differently, but just be aware that you'll need to figure out which one you would like to use. Predominantly, if you're working with Office 365, you'll tend to just use MS Online. That tends to give you most of the flexibility that you're looking for, even to manage user accounts. If you want to do some heavy Azure Active Directory outside of user accounts as well, and groups, doing some of the core configuration, for example, service principal names and a bunch of other things that you would do, then you'll use the Azure AD or the Azure AD preview. So once we have those installed, our very first step is making that connection. Now, of course, before we talk about the connection, you need to be aware, obviously, that you need to have an account in Office 365/Azure AD. And depending on whether the account has multi-factor authentication or not, can often determine how authentication flows and how that connection works. So there are 3 different ways of connecting. So we actually have web authentication prompt. So the web authentication prompt means that when I'm in the context of the PowerShell window and I add a connection, that connection will launch a browser window, kind of a smaller version, where I can enter my credentials. And then when the credentials have been passed, that window will automatically close, returning back the session into that PowerShell ISE window. Now, that's the one that you should be utilizing if you have any type of multi-factor authentication, whether it's a third-party multi-factor or you're using the Azure AD multi-factor services. You'll need to ensure that you force the web prompt so that you can go through the required bits and pieces and then go back to the normal. We also then can prompt for credentials. So prompting for credentials at this point, you're basically just going to, you get prompted like an old-fashioned Windows box, a Windows dialog box where you enter the username and the password. That works well if you don't need to force for multi-factor. However, what happens sometimes, if you open that Windows box and then type in the username and the password in that prompt and it saves it, if it does require multi-factor, you often get prompted twice. So you'll get prompted first in that box, you'll type the credentials, it will then save the credential, and then because you have multi-factor, it then launches the web browser anyway. Now, historically, this never used to do that. but now it kind of works that way. Now, the last option here is referred to as a service principal. This is a token that you generate within Azure AD. So imagine it as like a long GUID. And so you generate this service principal or GUID, and then you can pass that into the connection as well. So when you call the connect string in PowerShell, you would pass the service principal instead of passing credentials. Normally, you would utilize those, for example, if you're doing custom code. So I'm writing something in C# or Python or something. I don't want to pass credentials. I'm going to generate a client secret and a client ID, which gives me a service principal, and then I'm going to pass that as the authentication. So how do we actually connect to Azure AD? Well, very simply, it's connect-Azure AD. And then I have the option to confirm, and this will launch the web authentication prompt, so I'm able to get into Azure Active Directory. I can also pass credentials using the credential object. So get credential is the one that prompts that Windows box. I can basically pop to a Windows box, put the username and password in, click OK, it saves it to the credential object, and then I use connect Azure AD, and I can connect in, pass in that credential. Now, some of the common Azure AD PowerShell tasks that you'll want to complete, for example, it could be users and groups. It could be configuration that you wish to make changes to. So, for example, get Azure AD user. I could set an Azure AD user. I could create new security groups. I could make changes to the user group membership. So we have specific things that we can actually do for users and groups. Now, that's just a subset of the commands. I mean, the list is endless, but you could effectively just manage users and groups. From a settings and configuration perspective, some of these most common ones, you'll maybe want to be setting the password of the user. Maybe you want to confirm or add a new domain into your Office 365 or Azure AD. Maybe it's license details that you're trying to retrieve. So, for example, using get MSOL account SKU, that'll give you all of the account SKUs, as in the license names that you have. Or you may just want to get Azure AD tenant details. So these are kind of the common tasks that most people will do, specifically within Azure AD. Now, of course, there's lots more than this, and the list for Azure AD is just endless. And I'll show you some of those a little bit later. So now that we've talked about Azure AD, really for most of the management that you'll do in an Office 365 environment, you will tend to be focused in two other buckets, the two largest buckets, SharePoint Online and Exchange, if you've moved Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. So from a SharePoint Online perspective, it's a little bit different. When we connect to SharePoint Online, we can utilize the same process. So we can force the prompt for the username and password. So we can say credential, get credential. And then I can import the Microsoft.online.SharePoint.PowerShell module if we wanted to utilize that. It's exactly the same as if you were using SharePoint on premises too, except you wouldn't have the word online in there. And then for our last one, we're going to use connect SPO service, and then you can pass the URL that you wish to connect to. Now you'll see I'm using -admin. That's the SharePoint Online Admin Center URL. So whatever your tenant name is, which is normally your domain, at that point, -admin.sharepoint. But if I was connecting to a specific site collection, it would probably just be, site collection name.sharepoint.com or something else. So I can pass the credentials at this point, and it prompts me. Now, I don't need to use the -credential either. I could just use connect SPO service, and that would then force it to pop open in a web dialog in case we had multi-factor authentication enabled. And one of the fundamental things that you'll do when you're utilizing and trying to manage SharePoint Online is managing of site collections. Site collections are obviously the crux when it comes to storing of data. It contains the libraries and the lists, etc. So some of the common and commands that you'll utilize here, you'll notice you've got new SPO site. So you'll notice it's prefixed as SPO, so SharePoint Online, so new SharePoint Online site. Or you can retrieve the site, you can remove the sites, or we could actually create new site groups. And that's quite a common one when we talk about security, the ability for you to create new security groups or get groups or remove groups. These are the most common type commands that you would utilize. You can also manage site designs, scripts, upgrades, content moves. I mean, basically, The way it works in SharePoint Online, well, in fact, in most services that exist in Office 365, there's a PowerShell commandlet for most of the configuration and settings that you wish to change. So if we were to look at retrieving all the list of the site collections, so that I'm going to run get-spo site, and this will literally just list me every single site collection that's inside my tenant. Obviously, be aware this number may be significantly bigger than what you've seen. Historically, in the user interface, you were only able to see the site collections that were provisioned by you as IT or whoever had the permission to do that. And then when you ran the PowerShell commandlet, you would get that list, and then you would suddenly get all of these other ones that were provisioned through the Office 365 Groups infrastructure or the Microsoft Teams infrastructure. So PowerShell always was a little bit more powerful in retrieving more information than you would get in the user interface. If I want to retrieve a specific site collection, as in I'm looking at the properties of that because I need to change something or I want to make configuration updates, then I can use the same command, but I can pass in the identity this time, and then I can pass the HTTPS URL to that site. I can also then retrieve site collections by specific type. So STS-0 is actually the old school team site template. So if I'm looking in my list of, so for example, I worked with a client recently where they said they had 80 something site collections. When I actually ran the PowerShell, they had 600. They didn't quite realize there was that many because of Microsoft Teams and Office 365 Groups. But then I was able to filter those out and say, hey, let's look at them by specific template. I'm looking for something that's based on team site template. Or I could actually do a combination here and utilize a where command. I'm using the where command to also look for the template name. But the beauty of this is that when you combine the get command and then pipe the value out to a where command, I can then pass in other filtered information. So instead of saying template, or I could say template is equal to this, and then I could have another one that would say and has this in the URL. So we're able to filter the values very simply. Now, I'm not giving you a lesson on how to write PowerShell, but you get the idea here that we're able to filter out the values on the fly as we go through the commands. Now, of course, we also need to manage users as well. So for example, if you want to add a new user to a site collection, which is a common task, normally you'll say, well, hey, I have to go into the site settings, go to people and groups, and then add the individual users in. In actual fact, we can do this with PowerShell. Now, of course, the reason I'm showing you some of these is because this means that you can start to create these kind of reusable scripts, things that you don't need to go into the user interface. You can just have a PowerShell script that says, give me the name of the person. And as soon as you execute the PowerShell script, it'll go ahead and do all of the tasks that you're expecting. So adding a user into a security group, or for example, I'm adding them to the owners group, is as simple as saying, add SPO user, this is the site collection, this is the user, and this is the group. On the flip side of that, if I want to remove the users, then I can do this too. Now, I've had great success over the years talking about using PowerShell to administer SharePoint and Azure AD and Exchange, especially when it comes to some of the cleanup maintenance tasks that historically may not always get done, or you may not have an application that can do this for you. So I use an example of, a user leaves the organization. So you disable their Active Directory on-premises account, then something needs to happen in Office 365. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. And so PowerShell is definitely a tool, if you don't have an application that can do it, where you can run and execute a batch of jobs that are PowerShell related. And it could all be ran from on-premises. Now, of course, while we're talking about this, one of the things that we can do also is we can take the PowerShell that we write here, and we can actually, where you would run it on-premises, we could actually take this and put it up into the Azure cloud and run it inside an Azure function. So Azure functions, as well as Azure automation services, allow you to utilize PowerShell as a scripting language to do things. So you could, in fact, take scripts that you would write here and execute them from your machine to the cloud and actually save them, and put them in the cloud and execute them in the cloud as needed. So that's just a separate thing. We're not going to talk about that too much, but that's just a kind of an idea to throw out there. Now, as well as managing users, you'll maybe want to manage groups. So for example, if I want to create a new site group, so for example, I'm going to say in this specific site collection, instead of there being a group called owners or full control or whatever it would be, I want to create a group called sample group or executive group, whatever you want to call it. And then you get to assign the permissions from the default stack of SharePoint permissions that are available. So I'm going to assign full control at this point. Obviously, on the outside of that, we can also remove that group, that site group, and it's as simple as basically saying, go to that same site collection. This is the identity of the group that we just created. Go ahead and remove it. Okay, so that was some basics on SharePoint, and we'll actually come back and look at SharePoint using PowerShell shortly. So let's talk about Exchange. Now, of course, Exchange, in all fairness, tends to be the very first thing that most organizations move and utilize in Office 365. It's a simple decision, move my on-prem email to the cloud. But of course, what people forget and often don't realize is that that process of moving it also requires that we have to have Azure AD and a few other bits and pieces that are in there. So to connect to Exchange Online, the standard way of connecting is by utilizing what's called the new PS session. Now, this is the way that historically you would do it and the way that Microsoft would tell you to do it, outside of the fact that they're now adding, obviously, their Exchange downloadable module. So what you would do here is you're effectively connecting up to the cloud to that specific URL that's there, that Outlook Office365.com PowerShell Live ID. And what you're doing is you're passing your credential. So I have created a credential object already. And then the configuration name is Microsoft Exchange. And what this will do is this goes and creates and initiates an Exchange Online session. What that does is that goes and effectively gets the latest version of all of the PowerShell commandlets that are available in Exchange Online. And then what you then do is you import that current session that you've created into your existing PowerShell window. So what it means is you're not actually installing anything. There's no component to, like, there's no modules to say import module and do that. You basically just say, well, whenever I want to connect to Exchange, I'm actually just going to say import the session from the cloud and bring it down to my PowerShell window, and then I can do things with it. And we'll actually walk through that process shortly. Now, of course, the most common things here, user and group commands. So for example, you've got retrieving mail users, removing mail users, getting users, setting users, distribution groups, getting groups, adding distribution group members. You've got all of the common things that you would effectively want to do inside your Exchange Online admin console. They're available and they have PowerShell commands for them as well. So if I wanted to manage mail users, for example, I could use get-mail user. That would retrieve that. There's also another command, which is get-mailbox. Now, they are different. Mail user is the user. Mailbox is just the mailbox. And get mail user comes in combination with things like Azure AD and the MS Online commands as well as some of the on-premises PowerShell commandlets. So for example, any of these commands, you can normally pass an identity and say, I want to pass an identity to a user, and then I use format list to give me a list. And then of course, if I wanted to create a new mail user, then I'm going to say new mail user, pass in what the email address needs to be, what my Microsoft Online Services ID would be, and then some kind of password. You can see my super secure password there. And that would effectively create me a new mail user that is available to receive email and Exchange. Now, of course, once we have all the users in there, then of course, we look about managing distribution groups. So for example, if I want to create a new distribution group and add 4 people into it, then you'll see that I can say new distribution group, I've called it group, and then I'd have my comma separated array of email addresses that I wish to add. I can then also add members to an existing group by using a different command called add distribution group member. So you can see as we've kind of looked through bits and pieces so far that it's very straightforward in the way and the logic of the commands. You know, if there's something you need to create, 90% of the time it's new dash whatever that thing is that you wish to create. If there's something you wish to delete, it's normally remove dash and then the name of the thing. And this goes across all of the services in Office 365, even if we're talking about Skype for Business, Microsoft Teams, Security and Compliance Center, you name it, the commands all match the names of the things that you would wish to do. So I'm going to go into my PowerShell ISE. And so what I wanted to do here is I wanted to explain a couple of different things to you before we actually execute the command. So I'm just going to move this here. So you can see in this right-hand side, in the commands option, I'm just going to refresh this. Now the commands option that shows up is very, very helpful if you're not sure whether something has loaded at all. So if I scroll down here, you can see in the list which modules have been loaded. So first off, you can see Microsoft Online SharePoint PowerShell, that's been loaded. You can see Azure AD and Azure AD Preview. So I can instantly see if the module that I'm expecting to use is actually available. If I click on Azure AD, what this one does is it gives me the list of all the commandlets that are bundled into that module. So let's say this is the first time that you're trying to figure out how to use things. You can actually click on Connect Azure AD, and then I can say Show Details. And if the module is loaded effectively, then what it will do is it will give me the details. Now, of course, I haven't imported the module yet. That's perfectly fine. But when the module's in here, it will give me the details of what's in there. And this works for any of them. So if I click on them, you can see as I'm clicking through, for example, convert to SPO migration target, it gives me all the text options. So if I go to add SPO site design, I can see the common parameters, the regular parameters. And what I can then do, if I just type some values here, I'm actually just going to open up a new PowerShell window and say insert. And if I copy that, you'll see in this bottom section, it pastes in that command that I typed. So it's a quick way of you figuring out what's supposed to happen with a specific module or commandlet to know what's going on. Now I'm going to refresh again. And I want to show you something else that's been loaded. Now, if I scroll further down here, you'll see something called TMP. Now, the TMP ones are ones that have been imported into the existing PowerShell session. So when we talked about Exchange Online, that's where this comes from. So if I scroll down here, and if I say get, let's just scroll all the way down so we can see them. You can see get group. If I go there, you can see get mailbox. So you can see that these are the Exchange commands that have been pulled down. And so they are not loaded into a module that kind of makes sense just because it just has to come into the existing session and you end up with this. So let's go back to Azure. So in order for us to actually connect, I'm going to close this out so it's wider. You'll see that I'm going to say install the module, so Microsoft Online, install the module Azure AD, and install Azure AD Preview. You'll see I've got this other parameter here called allow clobber and force. This just means that I already have them installed, and I'm going to allow them to overwrite and do a force install. So what happens is we simply just select them and execute. What will happen is it goes out to the cloud. You'll see it downloads the package. It'll do MS Online first. It'll unzip and make sure it's all valid. It'll then go down and do Azure AD, and then it'll do Azure AD Preview as well. So we'll give that a moment to finish. That shouldn't take too long. So, and you can update these at any point, as long as you use the allow clobber and the force, that will actually ensure that it's always going to be up to date. You can also update them too. So there's an update command or an upgrade command for the module. Okay, so my Azure AD one is now done, and my Azure AD Preview should complete in a second. Now, once we have those done, in that right-hand section that we hadn't seen before, if you hadn't seen it, you could then load it and say refresh, and you would then see that those modules have now been loaded, and they would be listed in that drop-down that we looked at earlier. Okay, if there's any issues at this point, they'll be listed in the bottom section. I'm just going to scroll back up, and then we'll make some space. So the first thing I want to do is I actually want to look at connecting to Azure AD. So I'm going to click here, and it will say, yep, do you wish to connect? I'm going to say yes, and you'll see what happens. It launches me the window. I'm actually just going to close that. You'll notice it complains about authentication. The next option here, and I will go back to this one, is if I wanted to pass credentials. So I can say credential, get credential, execute, and you'll see there's the Windows box. And that's not connecting to anything. It's literally creating a credential profile that allows me to connect. I'm actually going to cancel that and it'll complain. So let's go back to my web browser version. Choose yes. I'm going to open up here and get my credentials for my demo environment. And don't worry, the password will be changed shortly. So you can see I'm now connected. I'm connected to the Azure cloud. That's my tenant ID, and that's my tenant domain. It's one of the Microsoft demo tenants. So now that I have that, I can actually come in and say get Azure AD user, and you'll see instantly it retrieves all of my user accounts. You can see the object IDs, which are the GUID references that we need to utilize, and then the user principal names for those, and then the type of object that it would be in Azure Active Directory. Now, if we flick into Azure AD here, well, actually, I'm just in Office 365. You can see the accounts. So there's my Adele Vance account, Adele V. If I go back to PowerShell and scroll, you can see, oops, it scrolled back down on me. You can see my Adele V account. So it's a like for like. It's literally just iterating through what's there. Now, one of the core tasks that is common in Azure AD is obviously to create an Azure Active Directory user. So I'm going to use the new Azure AD user command here. I'm going to give it the user principal name. And then I've got my given name, surname, display name, mail nickname, is the account enabled, and then a password profile. So I'm going to create the password profile. So you'll see here I'm using password profile, new object, and then using Azure AD model password profile with my super secure password of pass@word2020 bang. And then I'm going to say new Azure AD user. Okay, so that's created my new Azure AD account. Now, if I go back into here and just deselect that one and refresh, and we'll scroll down, you'll see in the L's that the account hasn't shown up yet. If I refresh again, you'll see now it shows up. So there's a small, it's only like a millisecond or a couple of seconds window where it doesn't show up. So just, it's a way of validating to make sure the account exists in the user interface at least. Now, if I go back to PowerShell and say get Azure AD user, and then if I just scroll up here, you'll see that the Liam Cleary account has been created. So it's a common task that you would do in Azure AD. You would obviously delete users or add users. But the most important thing to remember is that depending on which module you load or which module or commands you decide to use will determine which commands are available to you. So for example, whenever I go to any of the commands, it's going to give me some options. I can say, get me, the top 5 users, for example. So get Azure AD top 5, it gives me the top 5. I could also get filtered by using search string if I needed to. So just some basics there of what you would do with Azure. Now, if I flick across to SharePoint, SharePoint's a little bit different in the way that you would work with it. So we have obviously the way we talked about, which was grabbing the credential. So I could say get credential. It's going to ask me for those usernames and passwords again. So let me just grab the username and password and we'll look at connecting this way. And what happens here is it now successfully completes. And if I select credential, you'll see it's created me a username password. It's basically a key value pair. So username and then a secure string for that password. I'm then going to make sure that I've imported the module. If it hadn't imported, that would take a little bit longer to load, but I've already imported it. And then from here, I can say connect SPO service. It's going to pass that credential to the SharePoint environment. And now I've been successful in that connection. Now, of course, the interesting thing is here, nothing gets returned. So this is one thing to be aware of, that you may be used to utilizing PowerShell on premises, for example, where often you get great feedback that comes back from the commands. Some of the online ones don't really give you anything. They just it's done. Now, what's actually happened here is I'm now connected, but it doesn't tell me and it doesn't notify me that I am connected. But the way of knowing that is by saying get SPO site. And if my get SPO site command works, then my connect SPO service was successful. So just be aware there's not normally something that comes back and says, oh, hey, we are connected now. Now, of course, on any command, we can pipe values out and say, I only want to see the name and the template. Now, my My sites don't have names, they have titles, but name is blank, but it still renders the types of templates that are being utilized. Now I can also retrieve specifics around a site collection. So you can see from here, this is my URL, that's my owner, and then the storage quota. So just some basic information about that. Now, of course, we mentioned earlier about the idea of being able to retrieve information or at least filter the values. Now, I know if I go into here and go to where it says SharePoint, and if I load my SharePoint Admin Center, which should take a second, and go to Sites and click Active Sites, you can see that I have quite a few sites listed here. Some of them are team sites, some of them are communication sites. They're all different. But I want to be able to retrieve only specific ones. So I can say, I just want to get those that are set as site publishing. I'm going to execute that. And this then filters my list down to these are the sites that match that specific template. Now, of course, in a larger environment, when you have more site collections, this becomes really powerful, especially if you're trying to potentially make changes to the site collections by the type of template. I can also use that where command, which is similar. This will go back and just get me the sites that are Office 365 group sites instead. Now, of course, our last thing for SharePoint here is really around adding users. And if I go to my executive corner here, and if I go into site information and view all site settings, I can go to people and groups. And you can see that I have my list of users here, and then I have my list of groups on the left-hand side, so executive corner. If I click in the executive corner owners group, you can see that my Liam account doesn't exist. So I could go through all of these manual steps, or what I could simply do is say add SPO user to that specific group. Oh, it hasn't found my account yet. I don't think I actually created it properly. But if my account existed, it would let me add that account. Let me just double check. It should be in there. I have to give it a, oh, I forgot the magic step. The magic step that I was going to, which I wrote down to remind you, is to make sure that you license the user for the service with which you wish to add them to. Okay, so my account's been added now. So I should be able to re-execute that as long as it's synchronized. No, it's not synchronized yet, so we'll have to wait. But that will add the user into that executive corner owners group. So when I go back into people and groups here, and if I refresh this one, when it's been successful, it will list my name, Liam, here. And of course, I can then remove that also. I can remove that account if needed. Now, of course, moving on to Exchange, I'm going to clear the bottom section just because there's more information going to come through here. So I'm going to initiate my connection. So let me just make sure my credential object has a value in, and we'll double check it does here. Okay. And I'm going to say Exchange session, new PS session. It's going to go ahead and generate me that connection to Exchange. So this one can take a little bit more time just in the way it connects, because what it's also doing is populating that session. So if I click the session here, you can see that I'm connected to a remote machine with Exchange. And then what I'm going to do is say import the PS session. And then what you'll see here is you'll see this number changing. It keeps coming up saying objects received. And then it gives you this whole list of PowerShell commandlets that are now available inside that window. Oh, I didn't want to click that. Now I can retrieve the mailboxes. And of course, you'll notice it's now prompting me for the credential because I hadn't passed a credential to be able to do that one. And because it's a new session, or notice, because I'm not, let me just cancel that, cancel. Because I'm not using an existing session, it forces me to create a new session. So the good news is that if you've done this before and the session is created and the modules are installed, that even if the session is timed out and you can't do something, then when you actually execute get mailbox, the new session then gets generated. So it'll say new session. I'm going to copy this here. Now, if you're using the newer version of the PowerShell commandlets, then this works perfectly fine. It won't ask you, it'll just do it there. So you can see when I run get mailbox, it brings me the information specifically around the databases that are being used, the send quotas, etc. I can also retrieve specific information about a user. I'm just going to scroll this up here, and you'll see this gives you all of the properties that are associated to that individual user. So some of the commandlets will let you bring in specific individual things. Some of them will give you all of the properties that are required. If I then go to here to creating a new mailbox user, I could say create new mail user using this command. I'm going to create a new one called Liam Cleary E with Liam CE as the address with my new password. So I'm going to execute that one. And what this one does, which is nice, is it creates me a new account. So what does that actually look like? Well, if we go back into here and scroll to the top and say active users, I'm going to refresh the users. And we'll refresh. Because remember, there's that window of time where things don't get refreshed from one service to another. So we'll leave that going. Eventually, what you'll see is it will generate this other piece inside Azure Active Directory as well. So some of the commands, there we go. There's my Liam Cleary E. So you'll notice, even though I used an exchange commandlet, it actually created the other pieces that it required as well. Okay, so we'll come back to PowerShell a little bit later. Okay, so our final thing to talk about is security and permissions. And of course, this is really one of the big areas that I spend a lot of my time working with PowerShell for. So the first thing that needs to be done is enabling or disabling activity login. So this is done in the user interface, normally in the Security and Compliance Center. However, we can check this value directly with PowerShell. We can also then enable the audit log. So this is the admin audit log that we can enable. And we just simply say ingestion enabled, true, or we can disable it as false. This is required so that you can then utilize the audit log search to be able to find information about what end users or admins have actually been doing. Now, we can also enable and disable mailbox auditing. Now, there was a change made recently where Microsoft did enable mailbox auditing by default instead of it being switched off. So you can check this and you can actually enable it. So you can say set mailbox identity of the user audit enabled is true, or you can turn it off if you need to, or you can actually iterate through every single user and make sure that it's enabled. And you can then set everything for every single user. You can say, I'm looking for mailboxes and I want to get all the information from the audit settings of every single user. Now, because remember that not every single audit option is enabled by default. So mailbox auditing is great, but what isn't captured in the normal one is normally things like, let's say, you know, I am one of the executives and I have a PA that does bits and pieces on my behalf. You need to enable a higher level of auditing, and this can be checked by retrieving the mailbox audit settings. Now, of course, once we have all the audit settings enabled, I like to use PowerShell to retrieve the audit log entries. Even though the user interface is nice, it's much easier for me to bring things down. And of course, I like to use spreadsheets. So what we have is 3 audit logs that are available to us. One's the admin audit log. So that incorporates admin and end user activities. So for example, let's take SharePoint Online. That would be someone viewing a file or downloading it. If it was Exchange, it would be sending an email. So you have the mailbox audit log, and then we have the unified audit log, which is an amalgamation of all of the audit logs inside Office 365 brought together. Now, the good news is that each of these have PowerShell commandlets. So from an admin audit log search, we can search the admin audit log by passing in specific dates. For example, a start and an end date. We just use search-admin audit log. We can also look for specific types of events. So to find out whether somebody ran new role group or new management role assignments. So we can see if someone's been modifying permissions. From a mailbox perspective, we can literally just search the mailbox audit log and we can look for administration and delegation login types. So for example, like I mentioned, if I was an executive and I had a PA, I could then see what was going on based on dates and limit the result size. And then of course, our last one is the unified audit log, which allows me to search all activities across all the services in Office 365 between specific dates, for example, or I could look for specific types of records. So I could say, search the unified audit log, looking for Exchange admin record types, or it could be SharePoint, or it could be permission, or it could be Teams. It could be anything in the Office 365 stack at this point. Now, the audit log search for SharePoint is one that's quite common to use. This allows me to look for document views. So for example, I want to know who's been looking at specific documents, and I can pass specific dates. Or what I could do is look for specific object actions. So I'm looking for somebody accessing that specific document, and I want to know who it was. Now, the good news is that like this capability exists in the cloud, and the user interface. So I'm going to quickly flick to the user interface just to kind of show you as one of the last things to look at. So if I go to security and if I go to policies, that's it. We'll just type in the protection office.com, and then we'll wait for this to scroll down here. You can do search. Oops, I didn't click search. And go to audit log search. The audit log search here allows me to pick all the different types of activities. So you can see from a user interface perspective, like it's not the easiest to navigate around, especially if you're trying to create these kind of queries. So that's where, from a PowerShell perspective, if I go back here, that the PowerShell is cleaner and easier to use. You just pass in the specific object IDs and the types of commands that you're looking for. Okay, so next steps from me, install the PowerShell modules, install the base modules for Azure AD, SharePoint Online, and Exchange. Then obviously go and connect to Office 365, create those reusable PowerShell scripts that will allow you to connect to all the Office 365 services in PowerShell. Then utilize PowerShell with the audit log. Obviously, this is manual, so I'm going to be honest with you. You're using something that's manual, and you have to extract the data into a format that makes sense, and then you can do something with it. So create some reusable scripts if you wish to do that. And then, of course, you can audit the Office 365 environment. I do that frequently, and I use elements of PowerShell, but once again, it goes back to it's all manual. So obviously, there are tools available, and obviously, we'll talk about one of those tools now. But obviously, manual works, but it can often be a bit more complicated to generate the types of reports that you would be expecting. So I'm now going to turn it over to Jeff.
Cool. Well, thanks all, Liam. Let's see. Wrestle change here real quick. Perfect. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. You guys, as I mentioned earlier, will get a copy of the slides as well as the presentation. And as much as I like slides, not actually that much, I'm going to breeze through these relatively quickly so I can just kind of show things and get on to the Q&A. Basically, what do we do? Look at data across your entire infrastructure. We can do things like track changes, see who has access to data, as well as determine things like where sensitive data may actually be located. So a lot of cool stuff. On that side as well, there we go. A lot of out-of-the-box sources. So obviously AD, I'm going to cover as quickly as possible, a little bit Azure AD, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, etc. But bunch of different types of platforms. And again, we can also go in and crack open those files and discover where sensitive data is across a number of these platforms as well under the data discovery and classification. So with that having been said, let me dive right into the demonstration. So we've got a couple interesting things here. So again, we can look at not only changes, but what's currently going on across a variety of platforms. So let me start off with SharePoint. Not going to go into too much SharePoint stuff, but just sort of a general all activity. So who has touched data, checked out information, permission changes, all that kind of good stuff, makes it very easy to pull this information out. But not only do we do that, we also have the capability of seeing what's currently going on. So for example, if I want to go out and look at some of my SharePoint collections and what's actually out there, I can do that pretty easily. And I can get a kind of a full listing of these. I can drill down into these as well. So if I want to look at the financial site, I can do that. And this is, what my administrator account has access to. And if I drill down a little bit further, it'll tell me what everyone in here has access to. So you can see this guy here only has edit access, for example. So it gives you some pretty good information. One of the interesting things that this product allows you to do is also look at things like broken inheritance. That's really hard to find natively through the interface. And Liam can correct me if I'm incorrect, but I don't think so. Again, pipe up though if I am wildly wrong, but so allowing you to see things like broken inheritance is pretty cool. Also things like who has access to your data. So what level of access, and does anyone have access to that information? Again, a little bit harder to find. So it allows you to drill into this in a little bit more detail. Similar information around Exchange Online as well. Again, all different types of activity. So if you create a mailbox, if you give someone access to a mailbox, non-owner data. So it's one thing to give someone access to a mailbox. It's another to say, hey, who's actually using that level of access. So I go through and see what types of messages someone is actually looking at and digging into. You can also, beyond that activity, which is obviously helpful, I can drill in and again see things like user permissions on delegated mailboxes. So in other words, who currently has access? So we can track things like, hey, someone was given access to a mailbox, but now I can also see, hey, who actually has access to these mailboxes and what level of access is actually here. So you can see this guy here has access, excuse me, to this mailbox, and this account here has access to both of these mailboxes, and see exactly, again, what level of access that is. So it makes it a little bit easier instead of having to crack all of this stuff open and go through it a little bit more manually. Stuff on the Azure AD side as well, but I'm going to kind of cut that short as far as, again, really anything within Azure. And it also gives you some really handy filtering mechanisms as well for the origin. So for example, you probably don't care if something was replicated, if a group change was replicated up into Azure, for example, but you probably care if someone else goes into Azure directly and makes that change, and you can do that. Beyond pulling in all this different data, we can also do some other interesting things where I can go in and do some more kind of custom queries across the entire environment. So anything I'm looking at, whether it be on-prem or in the cloud or really a bit of both. So if I want to do kind of a quick query of what this guy's done the last 30 days for some reason, maybe he's leaving or maybe I just have a bad feeling about something, I can pull this data up. I can go through and I can include and exclude data as well. So in this case, hey, there's some folder changes. So I'm going to go through and I'm actually going to include this through this data record. And if I scroll down a little bit more, you can see, in this case, I've got all kinds of mailbox changes. And I might say, well, who's scripting all of this out? I'm really kind of curious, did he do something like a group change? And so I can kind of manually add these in here as well. So I do object equals group, and again, do kind of a quick search. And I can see everything that's taken place that meets this parameter. So SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, if this person had made changes to a file folder as well to an on-premise server, I would also see that roll up in this search interface. So it's really cool for things like root cause analysis, what did a specific user do in a certain time frame, et cetera. So hopefully that gives you just a super quick overview of what this product can do. Again, a lot of out-of-the-box reports, searches, and from the searches, I can do things like generate alerts. I can do custom reports. I can subscribe to them and have them generated automatically from a audit and compliance perspective. All kinds of really neat options for thresholding, risk scoring, and even having it go out and do other things. So you can actually have this go out and run things like PowerShell scripts. So, hey, when this type of thing happens, go out and do this. So if there's a large number of changes made to SharePoint files, for example, you could kick off a script to disable that account automatically. So again, a lot of neat add-ins. It can be something very, very simplistic like this. We also have some much more sort of advanced add-ons as well for things like integrations to Slack and ServiceNow and stuff like that. So with that having been said, let me pop out of here. I'll throw my slides back up. At least that's my plan. There we go. I think we're about done with slides, fortunately. So cool. So hopefully you've enjoyed what you've seen. I think Liam always does an awesome job as far as giving you some really great information. But if you hopefully were at least entertained or piqued by some of the data that's out there, feel free to go out and you can download the Netwrix product and try it out. It's a 20-day full-featured eval. If you have questions, problems, or whatever, please let us know. We do include support with the eval. You can also play around with the in-browser demo. It's kind of a walkthrough of the interface to see kind of what types of reports and how they work. And then obviously you can do some other demonstrations, etc. So with that having been said, knowing that I only have a few minutes left, let me pop out the questions pane. And let me dive into some of these. Oh, interesting. Okay, so this is just kind of a shout out to you, which I will read real quick. So it says, great job with the webinar, Liam. Also, kudos to mentioning that Exchange audit logs were enabled for all mailboxes, but is a more limited audit log. Oh, interesting. Okay, and then this guy, okay. All kinds of good information out here. Okay, cool. So, oh, this is an interesting question. Has Microsoft made the ability available to export a mailbox as a PST file via PowerShell? My understanding was this still wasn't available for Office 365.
Yeah, correct. It's not available yet. Even in the version 2 modules that they just released. I mean, actually, the version 2 one has like 12 commandlets in it compared to the rest. So I'm assuming it'll come at some point, but right now it's not made it into PowerShell online anyway. Obviously on premises it exists, but just not online.
Cool. Excuse me. Can you add the Office 365 licenses, AD Premium, etc., via PowerShell? It's kind of an interesting question.
Yep. You can definitely add the license in using PowerShell. It's a bit of a weird way of having to do it, but you effectively have to start at the highest level. So you start at the SKU level and say, what SKUs of licenses have I acquired for the tenant? And then you basically iterate through the SKUs to get the licenses for the services that you want. And then you basically create an array object that has, these are the licenses I want to apply. And then you can auto apply them to all accounts, single accounts, and you can remove them too. So all of that can be done using PowerShell.
Cool. So here's a question that just came in. Is there a PowerShell command to see why a user is having connection issues to 365 via the Outlook 365 thick client?
I mean, there's probably ways you could do it. There's no specific command for testing that. There are some kind of ways that you can make certain requests. So you could, for example, use a non-SharePoint Office 365 PowerShell and do like invoke request, and then basically try and call the endpoint, which would be the Office 365 endpoint. And then you could initiate that from a PowerShell window just on the device and say, invoke the request to the RESTful API that it's talking to, and then see what kind of time response or whatever you would get. There's also Microsoft released some stuff a while back. It's on GitHub. I can't remember the name of it, but you can utilize that where you spin up like an Azure VM, and then you have PowerShell commandlets online, kind of here locally, and then you can communicate with the Azure VM over PowerShell, and it gives you statistics and information about latency and timeouts and things like that too. So if you keep seeing lots of issues, then definitely you can go ahead and do and look at that in GitHub.
Okay, cool. So let me grab this question because I know we're almost out of time, and I'll dive into the giveaway bed. Are there any PowerShell commands related to cloud app security?
So cloud app security is a bit of a strange one. It doesn't really have anything specifically that's useful. There is a PowerShell module that is available to do some bits and pieces. It's one that's hosted on, it sounds like my answer is going back to GitHub all the time, but there is a PowerShell module available on GitHub. It's unofficial, but it is available. If you look for github.com/Microsoft/ I think it's MCAS, that's the unofficial PowerShell commandlet stuff for cloud app security.
Cool. So I realize we're out of time. So let me very quickly, because again, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, do the giveaway here. And let me see, I will Let's see whose name is given. Okay, so I apologize if I butcher your last name, but it's Arlen. Yes, Sodirijjo. It looks like. So, my sincere apologies as I butchered your last name, as I often do. So, my apologies. But Arlen, you should be getting a $100 gift card from Amazon on us. So feel free to buy some books if they still sell those, or anything else that your heart may desire at this point. So congrats. Let's see, are there any other questions we can hit real quick? There might be one or two that I've missed. So this is an interesting one. Then we can cut it if that makes sense. When using all the PowerShell commands to log in, are there commands that should be used to log out as well?
Yeah, so I mean that really comes down to session management and how you wish to do that. But yeah, so for example, I used Connect SPO service to connect to SharePoint Online. There is actually a disconnect SPO service. So majority of the time, I don't tend to see people actually utilizing them, even though they should do. So definitely, if you're writing reusable scripts and you don't want to have sessions end up crossing, like so whenever I write them. I'm often connecting to different tenants, multiple tenants. And so I try to make sure that I use the disconnects at the end when I finished so that my session is destroyed, so that then the next time I try to issue a command, it's not ran in the context of the wrong session. So definitely take a look at the disconnect ones. Most of them have a disconnect to actually kill those. There's also, for the PS session one for Exchange, there's a remove PS session, and you get the unique identifier of the session, then pass it in the remove command, and then it will clean that back up again for you.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Great question, actually. Cool. Well, everyone, I think that's about it. If I missed your question, my sincere apologies. Please feel free to reach out to us. Also, we're always up for feedback as well. So if you got some interesting ideas for new webinars or something you'd like us to cover, please let us know. Otherwise, I want to thank you all for your time, and thank you again, Liam. It's been a pleasure as always.
Hey, likewise. Thanks for having us.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot. And again, Arlen, congratulations. And the rest of you, thank you very much, and appreciate all of your time.
Have a good one. Enjoy your day.
Yep, take care. Bye.